It was a warm Tuesday afternoon when 16-year-old Jamal Thompson took his usual shortcut through the Oakwood Estates neighborhood. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns and elegant two-story homes. Jamal had his basketball tucked under one arm while his other hand occasionally checked his phone for messages from his mother. Jamal didn't notice Karen Westfield watching him from behind her living room curtains. The 45-year-old homeowner had lived in Oakwood Estates for nearly 8 years and prided herself on knowing every family in the community. Her eyes narrowed as she observed the unfamiliar black teenager walking slowly past her property. "I don't recognize him," Karen muttered to herself, clutching her coffee mug tightly. "He doesn't belong here." Karen watched as Jamal paused to tie his shoelace near her mailbox. In her mind, this innocent action transformed into something suspicious. She set down her mug and reached for her phone, fingers trembling slightly as she dialed 911. "Emergency services, what's your situation?" the dispatcher answered. "Yes, hello," Karen said, her voice hushed but urgent. "There's a suspicious young man walking through our neighborhood. I've never seen him before. He keeps looking at houses and stopping. I think he might be planning something." "Can you describe this person?" the dispatcher asked. "He's a black teenager, wearing a blue hoodie and jeans. He has a basketball with him, but I think that might be just for show," Karen replied, peering through the blinds again. "He's right outside my house now." Unaware of the drama unfolding, Jamal continued his walk, thinking about the math test he had studied for last night. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "We'll be home by 7. Start your homework before dinner." Jamal smiled and texted back, "On my way home now. Basketball practice ran late. Love you." 10 minutes later, a police cruiser slowly turned into the neighborhood. Officer James Davis and his partner Officer Michael Rodriguez had received the call about a suspicious person. They weren't expecting trouble, but neighborhood complaints required a response. They spotted Jamal walking along the sidewalk, matching the description they had been given. The officers pulled their car alongside him, the sound of gravel crunching under their tires making Jamal look up from his phone. Afternoon, Officer Davis called through his open window. "Mind if we have a quick word with you?" Jamal felt his heart rate increase. He had been warned by his parents about police interactions, coached on exactly how to behave. "No problem, sir," he replied politely, stopping in his tracks. Both officers stepped out of the car. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Officer Rodriguez asked, his tone neutral but his eyes watchful. "Just walking home from basketball practice," Jamal explained, gesturing to the ball under his arm. "I go to Westview High. This is a shortcut I take most days." From her front window, Karen watched the scene with satisfaction. She had done her civic duty, she thought. The police would handle things from here. She stepped onto her porch for a better view, arms crossed over her chest. "Do you live around here?" Officer Davis asked Jamal. "No, sir. I live in Riverdale Apartments, about 15 minutes from here on foot." "Can I see some ID?" Officer Rodriguez requested. Jamal's stomach tightened. "I'm 16, sir. I have my school ID." He carefully reached for his wallet, moving slowly as he'd been taught. As Jamal handed over his school identification, he noticed several neighbors had come outside to watch. The embarrassment washed over him in a hot wave. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, being questioned by police while strangers stared. Karen Westfield stepped closer, a small satisfied smile on her face. In her mind, she had prevented some unnamed crime from occurring in her perfect neighborhood. Little did she know how dramatically the situation was about to change. Officer Davis studied Jamal's school ID while Officer Rodriguez stood a few feet away, one hand resting near his belt. The school photo showed Jamal in a button-up shirt, smiling confidently, a stark contrast to the nervous teenager standing before them now. "Westview High basketball team, huh?" Officer Davis said, looking at the ID. "You guys had a good season last year." "Yes, sir," Jamal replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "We made it to the district finals." Karen Westfield moved closer, hovering just behind the officers. She wanted to hear every word of the exchange. 3 more neighbors had emerged from their homes, watching the scene unfold from their driveways. "So you're just passing through?" Officer Rodriguez asked, his eyes scanning Jamal's basketball and backpack. "Yes, sir. I take this route 3 times a week after practice. It saves me about 10 minutes compared to going around. Officer Davis handed the ID back to Jamal. We got a call about someone suspicious in the neighborhood. You understand we have to check these things out, right? Jamal nodded, though his chest felt tight. I understand. Maybe you should find another road home, Karen suddenly interjected, stepping forward. This is a private community, and people get nervous when strangers walk through. The officers turned, surprised by her interruption. Jamal's cheeks burned with embarrassment as more neighbors gathered. Ma'am, please step back, Officer Rodriguez said firmly. We're handling this. Karen didn't move. I'm just saying, he doesn't live here. We don't know what he might be doing. An older man across the street called out, What's going on? Is there a problem? The situation was growing tense. What had started as a routine stop was turning into a public spectacle. Jamal felt all eyes on him, judging, assuming the worst. Can I call my mother? Jamal asked quietly. She'll be worried if I'm late. Officer Davis nodded. Go ahead. With slightly trembling fingers, Jamal pulled out his phone and dialed. The call connected after 2 rings. Mom, he said, his voice lower than usual. I'm in Oakwood Estates. The police stopped me. They said someone called about a suspicious person. On the other end of the line, Dr. Michelle Thompson was just finishing a patient consultation when she received Jamal's call. Her face immediately turned serious as she listened. Stay calm, she told her son. I'm on my way. Put one of the officers on the phone. Jamal held out his phone to Officer Davis. My mom wants to talk to you. Officer Davis took the phone. This is Officer James Davis. Officer Davis, this is Dr. Michelle Thompson, Jamal's mother, came the clear, authoritative voice. I'll be there in 10 minutes. My son has every right to walk through that neighborhood. It's not gated, and there are no signs prohibiting pedestrians. Please ensure no one harasses him until I arrive. Something in her tone made Officer Davis stand a little straighter. Yes, ma'am. We're just doing a routine check. Everything is fine. Karen watched the officer's demeanor change, her confidence wavering slightly. Who is he talking to? She asked Officer Rodriguez in a hushed voice. His mother? The officer replied shortly, clearly uncomfortable with Karen's persistent presence. The minutes that followed were tense. Officer Davis tried to keep the situation calm, asking Jamal about school and basketball, attempting to make the encounter seem routine. But the growing audience of neighbors and Karen's obvious scrutiny made it impossible to ease the tension. Jamal stood tall, remembering his father's words. Never let them see you afraid. But inside, his heart pounded. This wasn't the first time he'd been singled out for simply existing in a space where some people thought he didn't belong. It probably wouldn't be the last. Then, the distinct sound of a luxury car engine broke the awkward silence. A sleek black Mercedes turned onto the street, moving with purpose. The car pulled up directly beside the police cruiser. Every head turned to watch as the driver's door opened. The confrontation was about to take an unexpected turn. Dr. Michelle Thompson ended the call with Officer Davis and immediately grabbed her purse. Her mind was racing, but her movements were controlled and precise, the same calm efficiency that had saved countless lives in the operating room. Dr. Roberts, I need to go. Family emergency, she told her colleague who had been reviewing charts with her. Can you check on the Williams patient in an hour? Dr. Roberts nodded, recognizing the look on Michelle's face. Everything okay? My son was just stopped by police for walking while black, Michelle replied, her voice steady but with an edge that betrayed her anger. I'll update you later. As she strode through the hospital corridors, nurses and orderlies moved aside. At 45, Dr. Thompson commanded respect without even trying. Her white coat bore the embroidered title Chief of Surgery, and today that authority radiated from her like heat. Reaching her car, Michelle took 3 deep breaths, a technique she used before difficult surgeries. She needed to be calm, collected, and clear-headed. Emotional outbursts wouldn't help Jamal. Strategic thinking would. As she drove toward Oakwood Estates, Michelle called her husband, Marcus Thompson. Marcus, Jamal just called. He's been stopped by police in that shortcut neighborhood he takes home from practice. What? Marcus's voice rose with concern. Is he okay? He's fine for now, Michelle assured him. I'm on my way there. I spoke briefly with the officer. Apparently, someone called in a suspicious person report. That route saves him 15 minutes, Marcus said, frustration evident in his voice. We talked about this happening someday. And we prepared him, Michelle replied, accelerating as she turned onto the main road toward Oakwood Estates. He sounded scared but composed. He did exactly what we taught him, stayed calm, identified himself, and called us. She paused at a red light, tapping her fingers on the steering wheel impatiently. I'll meet you there, Marcus said. No, Michelle countered. I'm already halfway there. You get dinner started. Jamal will need normalcy when this is over. We'll talk through it as a family later. The light turned green, and Michelle pressed forward, her mind cycling through approaches. In the operating room, she was known for her ability to stay composed under pressure. This situation required the same skills: assess, diagnose, treat. Her phone rang again. It was Jamal. Mom, where are you? His voice was quiet, as if trying not to be overheard. 5 minutes away, honey. Are the officers still there? Yes, Jamal replied. They're being okay, I guess, but there's this lady who called them. She keeps talking about how I don't belong here. Michelle's grip tightened on the steering wheel. What's happening right now? More people are coming out of their houses, Jamal said. It's embarrassing, like I'm some kind of criminal on display. Listen to me, Michelle said firmly. You've done nothing wrong. Hold your head high. I'll be there soon. As she turned into Oakwood Estates, Michelle noticed the neighborhood's manicured perfection, a kind of suburban wealth that often came with unspoken boundaries about who belonged and who didn't. She had encountered these invisible lines throughout her career, always pushing past them with excellence and determination. Can you put the officer back on the phone? She asked Jamal. A moment later, Officer Davis's voice came through. Dr. Thompson? I'm entering the neighborhood now. Black Mercedes. Where exactly are you located? We're on Maple Drive, near the intersection with Oak Lane. I see you, Michelle said, spotting the police cruiser and the small crowd that had gathered. She could make out Jamal's blue hoodie among the figures. Michelle disconnected the call and pulled up her mental checklist, the same one she used before entering any high-stakes situation. Assess the scene, identify the key players, remain calm, speak with authority, ask specific questions. Remember the goal: getting Jamal home safely with his dignity intact. As she neared the gathering, Michelle noticed a woman standing close to the officers, arms crossed, watching Jamal with obvious suspicion. This, she guessed, was the caller. The woman who had looked at her son and seen not a hard-working student but a threat. Michelle pulled up directly beside the police cruiser, put her car in park, and took one final deep breath. The conversation she was about to have would change more than just this afternoon. For some of these people, it would change how they saw the world. The black Mercedes came to a smooth stop alongside the police cruiser. The engine silenced, and for a moment, nothing happened. The neighbors watched, curiosity etched on their faces. Karen Westfield stood with her arms still crossed, a slight frown forming as she wondered who had arrived. When the car door opened, Dr. Michelle Thompson emerged with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to making entrances. She wore deep blue surgical scrubs under an unbuttoned white lab coat. Her hospital ID badge hung from a lanyard around her neck, the word CHIEF visible in bold red letters even from a distance. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and despite the interruption to her day, she looked completely composed. Officer Davis straightened his posture almost instinctively as Dr. Thompson approached. She walked directly to Jamal first, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. Are you okay? She asked quietly. Jamal nodded, relief washing over his face. I'm fine, Mom. Michelle squeezed his shoulder reassuringly before turning to face the officers. Her expression was calm but determined, her eyes sharp and assessing. I'm Dr. Michelle Thompson, Jamal's mother, she said, extending her hand to Officer Davis. Thank you for allowing him to contact me. Officer Davis shook her hand, his demeanor professional but noticeably more respectful than before. Ma'am, we were just responding to a call about a suspicious person in the neighborhood. And that suspicious person was my 16-year-old son walking home from basketball practice. Michelle asked, her voice level but with an edge that made several onlookers shift uncomfortably. Officer Rodriguez stepped forward. We're required to check out all calls, Dr. Thompson. Your son was fully cooperative. Michelle nodded. I understand you have a job to do, officers. My concern is why someone felt the need to call the police on a teenager walking down a public street. Her gaze shifted to Karen, who had taken a small step backward when Michelle emerged from the car. Karen's confident stance had faltered, replaced by a growing uncertainty as she took in Michelle's professional appearance and authoritative presence. Was it you who made the call? Michelle asked directly, turning to face Karen. The neighbors who had gathered fell silent, all eyes moving to Karen. Under this collective gaze, Karen's cheeks flushed pink. Yes, Karen admitted, lifting her chin slightly. We got break-ins in the area. I didn't recognize him. I see, Michelle said, her voice measured. And what specifically about my son appeared suspicious to you? Karen struggled to maintain eye contact. He was walking slowly, looking at houses. He was walking home, Michelle corrected. This route saves him 15 minutes. He's taken it for the past year without incident. One of the officers cleared his throat. Dr. Thompson, if I may ask, are you with City Memorial Hospital? The badge? Yes, I'm chief of surgery there, Michelle replied without taking her eyes off Karen. The effect of her words was immediate. Several of the watching neighbors exchanged glances. Karen's eyes widened in recognition. Thompson, are you Michelle Thompson? Karen asked, her voice suddenly less certain. Yes, Michelle confirmed. Karen's face paled. The Dr. Thompson who performed my husband's emergency cardiac surgery last year? A heavy silence fell over the scene. Michelle studied Karen's face for a moment before recognition dawned in her eyes. Mr. Westfield. Triple bypass in October, Michelle said quietly. He had complications during recovery, I remember. Karen's arms, which had been firmly crossed over her chest, now fell limply to her sides. The neighbors watching could almost see her mental recalibration happening in real time. The woman who had saved her husband's life was the mother of the boy she had just reported as suspicious. Officer Davis, sensing the shifting dynamics, took a step back. Well, it seems there's been a misunderstanding here. Michelle turned back to the officers. Is my son free to go? Or is there some charge against him for walking through a non-gated public neighborhood? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Off to the side, Jamal watched his mother with a mixture of pride and amazement. This was the woman who had taught him to hold his head high, to never apologize for taking up space in the world. He's free to go, Officer Rodriguez confirmed. No laws were broken here. Michelle nodded once, then turned to her son. Let's go home, Jamal. Karen Westfield stood frozen on the sidewalk, her mind racing to process what was happening. The woman standing before her, the mother of the boy she had just reported to police, was the same surgeon who had worked for 6 hours straight to save her husband David's life after his massive heart attack last year. You're that Dr. Thompson? Karen repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Michelle nodded once, her expression unreadable. Yes, Mrs. Westfield. I remember your husband's case quite well. Several of the watching neighbors began to murmur among themselves. The Westfield situation had been well known in the community. David's heart attack at the neighborhood pool, the ambulance rushing him to City Memorial, the touch-and-go prognosis for days afterward. I didn't know. Karen's voice trailed off, unsure how to finish that sentence. Didn't know what? That the black teenager walking through her neighborhood had a mother who was one of the city's most respected surgeons. That the family she viewed with suspicion had likely saved her own. Officer Davis cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Well, since there's no issue here, we'll be on our way. He nodded to Michelle. Dr. Thompson, it was educational meeting you. Likewise, officer, Michelle replied, her professional demeanor never wavering. As the police prepared to leave, an older man stepped forward from the small crowd of onlookers. Mr. Jenkins, the retired high school principal who lived at the corner house, approached with a concerned expression. Dr. Thompson, he said, extending his hand. I'm Robert Jenkins. I want to apologize for this situation. This neighborhood should be safe for everyone to walk through. Michelle shook his hand. Thank you, Mr. Jenkins. Your son has every right to be here, he continued, loud enough for everyone to hear, and I'm ashamed this happened. Karen stood awkwardly to the side, her face flushed with embarrassment. The police cruiser pulled away, leaving her exposed without the buffer of official authority. Several neighbors were now looking at her with open disapproval. "Dr. Thompson," Karen finally said, her voice strained. "I never meant to." "Mrs. Westfield," Michelle interrupted calmly, "I understand that safety concerns exist in every neighborhood. But I would ask you to consider what specific behaviors made my son appear threatening to you." Karen opened her mouth, then closed it. The truth was uncomfortable. She had seen a young black man in a hoodie and immediately assumed the worst. "I think," Michelle continued when Karen didn't respond, "that we should all examine the assumptions we make about people based solely on appearance." Jamal stood quietly beside his mother, shoulders straight despite his discomfort. He had been raised to handle situations like this with dignity, but that didn't make the experience any less humiliating. "Mom," he said softly, "can we go now?" Michelle put her arm around her son's shoulders. "Yes, we can." As they turned to leave, Mrs. Chen from 3 houses down approached them. "Dr. Thompson, I don't think we've met, but I'm a nurse at City Memorial. You probably don't remember, but you consulted on my mother's case last year." Michelle smiled genuinely. "Of course. Mrs. Liu, gallbladder complications. How is she doing?" "Much better, thanks to you," Mrs. Chen replied warmly. She turned to Jamal. "Young man, you're welcome to walk through this neighborhood anytime. In fact, if you ever need water or anything on your way home, my house is the blue one with the cherry tree out front." This small gesture of kindness brought a slight smile to Jamal's face. Mitchell nodded appreciatively at Mrs. Chen. As they walked toward Michelle's car, Karen watched them go, the reality of her actions sinking in deeper with each passing second. Not only had she racially profiled an innocent teenager, but she had done so to the son of the woman who had saved her husband's life, a respected doctor whose hands had literally held David's heart. The revelation left her standing alone on the sidewalk as neighbors returned to their homes, some deliberately avoiding eye contact with her. The perfect afternoon in her perfect neighborhood had shattered into uncomfortable truths she could no longer ignore. Michelle helped Jamal place his basketball and backpack in the back seat of her Mercedes. She could see her son was putting on a brave face, but 17 years of motherhood had taught her to recognize the small signs of his distress, the slight tension in his jaw, the way his eyes didn't quite meet hers. "You okay to drive home with me, or would you rather walk the rest of the way?" she asked, giving him the choice. "I'll ride with you," Jamal replied quietly. "Thanks for coming, Mom." Michelle squeezed his shoulder gently. "Always." She paused, looking back at the scene they were about to leave. Most of the neighbors had dispersed, but Karen Westfield still stood on the sidewalk, looking lost and uncomfortable. Michelle made a decision. "Actually, I need to talk to Mrs. Westfield before we go. Just for a minute." Jamal's eyes widened slightly. "Mom, can we just leave?" "5 minutes," Michelle promised. "You can wait in the car if you want." Jamal hesitated, then shook his head. "No, I'll come with you." Together, they walked back toward Karen, who seemed to shrink into herself as they approached. The few remaining neighbors watched with undisguised interest. "Mrs. Westfield," Michelle said, her voice calm but firm, "I think we need to have a conversation." Karen nodded, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. "Yes, of course." "I'm curious," Michelle continued, maintaining steady eye contact. "What exactly did you tell the police when you called them?" Karen swallowed hard. I said there was a suspicious person in the neighborhood." "And what made my son suspicious?" The directness of the question hung in the air. Karen struggled to find words that wouldn't reveal her prejudice. "He was walking slowly, and I didn't recognize him," she finally said. "Is everyone you don't recognize suspicious?" Michelle asked. "Do you call the police on the mail carrier substitute, or the food delivery person, or the landscapers working at your neighbor's house?" Karen's face flushed deeper. "No, but my son is black," Michelle finished for her. "And in your mind, that made him suspicious." A few feet away, Mr. Jenkins nodded in agreement, not bothering to hide his disapproval of Karen's actions. "I didn't mean it like that," Karen protested weakly. "Perhaps not consciously," Michelle replied, "but intentions don't change impact. Do you understand what could have happened today? How situations like this can escalate?" Karen looked down at the sidewalk. "I remember you now, from the hospital. You were so kind to my family when David was recovering. You even called personally to check on him after he was discharged. Yes, Michelle said, because that's what decent people do. They care for others regardless of what they look like. They don't assume the worst based on skin color. Jamal stood tall beside his mother, his presence a silent testimony to the conversation's importance. I'm sorry, Karen said, finally looking directly at Jamal. I truly am. I didn't think about how this would affect you. That's part of the problem, Jamal replied, speaking up for the first time. People never think about how it feels to be treated like a criminal for just existing. His words, spoken without anger but with profound truth, seemed to hit Karen harder than any accusation could have. You saved my husband's life, Karen said to Michelle, tears forming in her eyes. And this is how I repaid that kindness. Michelle's expression softened slightly. This isn't about repayment or gratitude, Mrs. Westfield. It's about seeing people as people. My son walks this route 3 times a week. He's a straight-A student headed for college next year. But even if he wasn't those things, you would deserve to walk down a public street without being reported to police. Karen nodded, wiping at her eyes. You're right. I'm truly sorry. Michelle took a deep breath. I appreciate your apology, but I hope this is a moment of change for you, not just embarrassment. As they turned to leave again, Michelle noticed several neighbors had moved closer, listening to the exchange. Some nodded in agreement with her words. Others looked uncomfortable, perhaps recognizing themselves in Karen's actions. The confrontation hadn't been about shame or revenge. It had been about truth. The kind of truth that might just change a community, one difficult conversation at a time. The morning after the incident, Jamal sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone with a troubled expression. Mitchell poured herself a cup of coffee and sat across from him. What are you looking at? She asked gently. Jamal turned his phone to show her. On the screen was the community Facebook page for Oakwood Estates. Someone had posted about yesterday's events, and the comments section was exploding with responses. It's everywhere, Mom, Jamal said quietly. Mr. Jenkins posted about what happened. Michelle took the phone and read the post. Yesterday, I witnessed something in our neighborhood that deeply disturbed me. A young man walking home from basketball practice was stopped by police because someone reported him as suspicious. The young man was simply trying to get home. His mother, who happens to be the chief surgeon who has saved several lives in this very community, had to leave work to resolve the situation. We need to have a serious conversation about why this happened and how we can do better. The post had over 100 comments already. Mitchell scrolled through them, her expression growing more thoughtful with each swipe. Look at this, she said, showing Jamal. Mrs. Chen replied with a link to an article about racial profiling. And here, 3 other neighbors are sharing similar experiences their children have had. Jamal leaned over to look. Wow, I didn't realize Zach's family dealt with this too. You never mentioned it. Sometimes it's hard to talk about, Michelle said. But look at these responses. People are actually listening. Not all the comments were supportive. Some defended Karen, saying she was just being cautious. Others suggested Jamal should have taken a different route. But the majority expressed shame and concern about what had happened in their community. By lunchtime, the story had spread beyond the neighborhood Facebook group. Michelle's phone rang with a call from Deanna Mills, a reporter at the local newspaper. Dr. Thompson, I'm calling about an incident that reportedly happened yesterday in Oakwood Estates. Would you be willing to comment? Michelle glanced at Jamal, who was now working on homework at the table. I'm not interested in public shaming, she told the reporter. But I would be willing to discuss the broader issues at play here. That's exactly what we're interested in, Deanna replied. Would you and your son consider being interviewed for a feature on implicit bias in our community? After consulting with Jamal and her husband Marcus, Michelle agreed to the interview. 3 days later, the front page of the local section featured a photo of the Thompson family sitting together on their porch, alongside the headline, When Bias Calls 911, A Family's Experience Prompts Community Reflection. The article detailed the incident without naming Karen Westfield, focusing instead on the larger pattern of racial profiling and its impact on families like the Thompsons. Michelle was quoted discussing the psychological toll these encounters take on young people of color. Even when these situations don't escalate to violence, she explained in the article, They send a message to children like my son that they don't belong, that they are automatically suspicious. That's a heavy burden for any young person to carry. The article prompted an outpouring of support. Emails and cards arrived at the Thompson home from community members expressing solidarity. Jamal's basketball coach devoted time during practice to check in with all his players of color about similar experiences. Most surprisingly, 5 days after the incident, Mitchell received an email from the president of the Oakwood Estates Neighborhood Association. Dr. Thompson, our community has been deeply affected by what happened to your son. We're scheduling an emergency meeting to discuss how we can make our neighborhood truly welcoming to everyone. Would you consider attending to share your perspective? When Mitchell showed the email to Jamal, he considered it for a long moment. Do you think anything will actually change? He asked, skepticism clear in his voice. Mitchell put her arm around his shoulders. I don't know, but change has to start somewhere. And it usually begins with people being willing to listen. Across town, Karen Westfield sat alone at her kitchen table, the newspaper open to the Thompson family's story, tear stains marking the edges of the paper. The Oakwood Estates Community Center was filled to capacity on Thursday evening. Extra chairs had been brought in, but still, people lined the walls. The neighborhood association had never seen such attendance for a meeting. At the front of the room, a small table with 4 chairs waited for the panel speakers. Michelle and Jamal Thompson arrived 5 minutes early, greeted by Robert Jenkins, who had organized the event. Marcus Thompson, Jamal's father, woke beside them, his hand resting supportively on his son's shoulder. Michelle nodded, scanning the crowded room. Her eyes stopped briefly when she spotted Karen Westfield sitting in the back row. At 7:00 p.m. sharp, the meeting began. Mr. Jenkins welcomed everyone and explained the purpose of the gathering. Last week, something happened in our neighborhood that made many of us uncomfortable, he said. But being uncomfortable is sometimes necessary for growth. Tonight is about listening and learning. He introduced the Thompson family and invited Michelle to speak first. She walked to the microphone with the same confident stride she used entering an operating room. Good evening, she began. I'm not here to point fingers or assign blame. I'm here as a mother who wants her son to live in a world where he isn't automatically viewed as suspicious. For the next 15 minutes, Michelle spoke about the reality of raising a black son in America. She talked about the conversations black parents must have with their children that other parents never need to consider. She described how she and Marcus had taught Jamal to respond if stopped by police, how to keep his hands visible, how to stay calm even when afraid. These are survival skills, she explained. Skills no child should need to learn, but skills that might save his life. When she finished, the room was silent. Then Jamal approached the microphone. At 16, he stood tall but still had the softness of youth in his face. He cleared his throat nervously. I've walked through this neighborhood for over a year, he said. I always felt a little out of place, but I never thought someone would call the police on me. His voice grew stronger as he continued. That day, I felt humiliated. I felt like no matter what I achieve or how hard I work, some people will only ever see my skin color first. But I also learned something important from my mom that day. I learned that standing up for yourself doesn't have to mean getting angry. It can mean asking the right questions and helping others see their own bias. The applause that followed Jamal's words was spontaneous and heartfelt. Several people wiped tears from their eyes. Mr. Jenkins then opened the floor for community responses. One by one, neighbors came forward. Some shared their own experiences with prejudice. Others acknowledged times they had made unfair assumptions. The conversation was honest, sometimes uncomfortable, but remarkably respectful. Near the end of the meeting, a movement at the back of the room caught everyone's attention. Karen Westfield slowly made her way to the microphone. Her hands trembled visibly as she adjusted the height. I'm Karen Westfield, she said, her voice quiet but determined. I'm the person who called the police that day. A murmur ran through the crowd, but Karen continued. I've spent the past week thinking about why I made that call. The truth is hard to admit, but I saw a young black man in a hoodie, and I automatically assumed the worst. I never stopped to question that assumption. She turned to face the Thompson family directly. Dr. Thompson saved my husband's life last year. Her skills as a surgeon gave us more years together. And yet, when I saw her son, I didn't see someone worthy of the same care and respect I'd want for my own family. Karen's voice broke slightly. I can't undo what I did, but I can promise to do better. I've signed up for bias training at the community college, and I'm committed to changing not just my actions but the thinking behind them. When the meeting ended 2 hours later, small groups lingered, continuing conversations that had begun inside. Michelle found herself surrounded by neighbors introducing themselves, many offering sincere apologies for what Jamal had experienced. As they prepared to leave, Karen approached the Thompson family hesitantly. "Would it be possible," she asked, looking at Jamal, "for you to teach me about basketball sometime? My nephew is interested, and I know nothing about the game." It was a small gesture, awkward perhaps, but a genuine attempt to begin building a bridge. Jamal looked at his parents, then back at Karen. "Yeah," he said with a small smile, "I can do that." As they walked to their car, Michelle put her arm around her son's shoulders. "I'm so proud of who you are," she told him. "I learned from the best," Jamal replied, looking at both his parents. "Besides, if one person can change, maybe others can too."